Roy Callahan had been farming the same 640 acres in western Kansas for 31 years. Same county road, same winter wheat rotation, same Massey Ferguson iron he'd trusted since his father handed him the keys to a worn-out MF 265 the summer he turned 19. Back then, a man picked a brand the way he picked a church. You didn't do it casually, and you didn't switch when things got hard. But things had gotten hard, real hard. The spring of Roy's 31st year on that land had started with a broken well pump and ended with a hailstorm that knocked 80% of his wheat crop flat 2 weeks before harvest. Insurance covered some of it, not enough. The bank in Dodge City had been patient, more patient than Roy deserved. His loan officer, Tim Graber, had said with the flat politeness of a man who'd seen too many farms fold. Roy had 2 operating notes outstanding, a land payment coming due in November, and a parts bill at the implement dealer that he'd been rolling over since February. The Massey Ferguson 8450 planter had been the crown of his operation. 12 rows, individual row clutches, seed population monitor that Roy had personally calibrated 3 separate times because he didn't trust the factory settings. He'd bought it 6 years ago on a good year, paid cash for the down payment, financed the rest over 4 years, and paid it off early. It was his, free and clear. And it was, by his own stubborn assessment, the finest piece of equipment he owned. Tim Graber did not share that assessment. "Roy," he said across the desk that October morning, "the bank needs you to liquidate something meaningful before the November note comes due. The planter is your cleanest asset. You've kept it up. It'll bring something at auction." Roy stared at the man for a long time without speaking. "That planter put 15 crops in the ground," he finally said. "I know it did," Graber said, "and it needs to put money in your account before the 15th. Roy drove home that afternoon, past 3 neighbors' fields, all harvested clean, combines gone, ground worked down flat for winter. His own field sat quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. He pulled into the machine shed and stood in front of the 8450 for 20 minutes with his hands in his coat pockets, not touching anything, just looking. He called the auction house the next morning. Burkhart Farm Auction had been running estate and retirement sales across southwest Kansas for 40 years. Dale Burkhart himself answered the phone. Roy explained the situation without embarrassing detail, just that he had a 12-row Massey Ferguson 8450 planter, well-maintained, individual row clutches, monitor system that he needed to move before mid-November. Dale said he had a general farm equipment auction scheduled for the 8th of November, 12 days out. He'd send a man to look at it and set a floor. The appraiser showed up 2 days later, a younger man named Garrett who chewed sunflower seeds and walked around the planter with a clipboard and a flashlight. He checked the disc openers. He checked the finger pickup seed meters. He checked the row unit down pressure springs. He looked at the monitor cable connectors. Roy followed him without saying anything, because Roy knew the machine was right and didn't need to sell it. Garrett set a reserve of $22,000. Roy thought it would bring 26, maybe 28 if the right buyers showed up. There were still farmers in that part of Kansas putting corn in ground, and a clean Massey Ferguson 12-row with individual row clutches was not something you found every week. He spent the intervening days doing what he always did with equipment before it left the yard. He greased every Xerx fitting. He checked the chain tension on the seed drive. He pulled the seed tubes and blew them out with compressed air. He touched up the paint on one of the wing sections where a rock had chipped it the previous spring. He replaced 2 row unit closing wheel bolts that were starting to show wear. He did all of this with the quiet efficiency of a man preparing a horse for sale, making it right not to deceive a buyer, but because that was how you cared for machinery. On the morning of the auction, Roy hitched the planter behind his pickup and pulled it the 18 miles to the Burkhart sale yard. He got there early, before most of the crowd. He unhitched in the equipment row, lowered the wing sections, and walked the length of the machine one more time in the thin November light. The sale yard filled up by 9 o'clock. There were 140, maybe 160 people, farmers in canvas coats, implement dealers in company-branded gear, A few men Roy didn't recognize who moved through the equipment rows with their phones out taking pictures. The kind of men who showed up at Kansas farm auctions and bought things to move them east or south. Roy had sold to those men before and felt ambiguous about it. A piece of his ground's history, going to work in Mississippi or Missouri, out of the soil that built it. He walked the crowd without stopping to talk much. He nodded to men he knew. A few asked him about the planter, what it had planted, how the meters had held up, what population it had been set for last. He answered honestly and without embellishment. A man named Harlan Stuber, who farmed about 800 acres east of Buckland, told Roy he'd been looking for a Massey Ferguson 12-row and that he thought the 8450 was a better unit than the comparable John Deere 7000 series that showed up in auctions around there. Meters are more consistent, Stuber said. I don't care what the green guys say. Roy almost smiled. The auction started at 10. Burkhart moved through the small equipment quickly. A hay tedder, 3 sets of disc blades, a cultipacker, an old PTO generator that drew some spirited bidding from the crowd. Roy found himself watching without absorbing any of it. He was watching the people who had walked his planter row, counting them, trying to read what kind of money was standing in that field. When they got to the planters, they ran 2 older units first, a 6-row John Deere 7000 and a worn 8-row white that brought barely enough to justify its own transportation. Then Dale Burkhart pointed his microphone at the Massey Ferguson 8450. Roy was standing 40 feet away. He watched Burkhart walk around the machine with the kind of professional salesman's confidence that made every piece of equipment sound like the last best deal a man would ever see. He heard Burkhart mention the row clutches. He heard him mention the monitor system. He heard him say, "This is a clean unit, gentlemen. You won't find better maintained iron in southwest Kansas today." And then Burkhart reached up to demonstrate the hydraulic fold function. What happened next took about 4 seconds. The fold actuator on the right wing section fired the way it was supposed to. The wing began to lift, and then, with a sound that Roy would describe later as something between a crack and a groan, the kind of sound that stops a room, the main pivot arm on the right wing section let go. Not completely, not catastrophically, but enough. The wing section dropped 6 inches and canted outward at an angle that no properly functioning planter ever makes. The hydraulic line pulled tight. The row units on that wing skewed sideways. One of the seed tubes kinked. A closing wheel assembly that Roy had been meaning to look at, had told himself was fine, had convinced himself could wait, swung loose on its mount and dangled. The crowd went quiet. Roy felt the silence before he processed what he was seeing. That particular silence, the kind that runs through a farm auction crowd when something goes wrong with a piece of equipment on the block, is not the silence of sympathy. It is the silence of calculation. Every man standing in that field was instantly repricing what they'd been willing to bid. Dale Burkhart kept his voice smooth. 30-some years in the auction business had given him the ability to narrate disaster without sounding rattled. He said the unit would be sold as is, that a buyer with mechanical ability would find value here, that the basic structure and meter system were sound. He started the bidding at $12,000. Roy's floor was 22. It didn't matter. The bidding climbed to 14,000 and stalled. A man Roy didn't know pushed it to 14,500. Stuber, the farmer from Buckland who had said the Massey Ferguson meters were better than green. Stuber bid 15,000 and stopped there. A dealer from Liberal came in at 15,200. Burkhart worked the crowd for 3 more minutes. The hammer fell at $15,750. Roy stood in that field and did the arithmetic. He was $6,200 short of the reserve. He was more than $10,000 short of what he needed to make the banknote whole. The closing wheel assembly was still dangling from the right wing section, swinging slightly in the November wind, and every man in that auction yard could see it. Roy Callahan had been farming 31 years. He had buried a hired hand. He had watched his father's health fail on land his father had broken. He had gone through 2 droughts and a farm crisis, and a year when the price of wheat dropped so low that the diesel to harvest it cost more than what the elevator paid. He was not a man who fell apart in public. But standing in that auction yard, watching a stranger write a check for his planter at 60% of what it was worth, or had been worth, 40 minutes ago, Roy felt something he hadn't felt in 31 years of farming. He felt small. He drove home in the afternoon with an empty trailer and a number in his head that didn't work. The banknote was due in 17 days. He sat at the kitchen table that night with a yellow legal pad and a calculator and worked through every version of the numbers he could construct. He could call in a favor from his brother-in-law in Pratt, but that conversation would cost him something that wasn't money. He could defer a lease payment on one of his rented quarters, but that landlord was already impatient. He could sell the MF 8100 tractor, but that was his fieldwork tractor, his planting tractor, and without it he was not a farmer, he was a man with land. He went to bed at 11 without solving anything. At 5 the next morning, Roy's phone rang. It was Harlan Stuber. "I've been thinking about your planter," Stuber said. He didn't apologize for the hour. Farm people don't. Roy said he'd sold it at auction. "I know you did," Stuber said. "I was standing there, I bid $15,000 on it before that wing came apart." Roy waited. "That pivot arm," Stuber said, "that's a weld failure. Probably an old stress crack that worked through. I've seen it on 8400 series units before. It's not the whole wing. It's not the frame. It's a repair. The man who bought it knows that too. He got it cheap, and he'll fix it for $500 and plant corn with it in the spring." Roy said he understood that. "What I'm calling about," Stuber said, "is whether you have anything else to sell. Because I'm looking for a good set of row units. Individual pickup meters, 12 row or better, and I'd rather deal with a man I know than with a sale barn." The conversation that followed lasted an hour. By the end of it, Roy had agreed to sell Stuber a set of 12 additional row units that he'd been storing in the back of the machine shed, units he'd pulled from an older MF planter years ago and kept as a hedge against parts scarcity. They were clean. They were matched. Stuber wanted them because he had a worn planter frame he'd been considering rebuilding, and a set of matched row units in good shape was exactly what that project needed. They agreed on a price of $4,200. It wasn't enough to cover the gap by itself. But it was something. Over the next 10 days, Roy did what farmers do when their back is against the fence and they can't afford to let it show. He worked the phone quietly. He sold a set of rolling baskets he'd never used. He sold a spare PTO shaft and 2 hydraulic cylinders he'd bought at an estate sale 3 years ago for exactly this kind of moment. He sold a shop tool chest, a snap-on that had been his father's, to a mechanic in Buckland who'd wanted it for years. That one hurt in a different way than the planter. He called Tim Graber at the bank on the morning of the 14th and told him he would have a check on the 15th. Graber asked if he needed a short extension. "No," Roy said. "I'll have it." He had it. Barely. Scraped together from the auction proceeds and 4 private sales and a small amount he'd been holding in a farm account that he'd told himself was for equipment repairs. He walked into the Dodge City Bank on the 15th of November and wrote a check to cover the note and stood at the teller window while it processed. On the drive home, Roy stopped at the implement dealer in Buckland, where he'd had an outstanding parts bill since February. He didn't pay all of it. He couldn't. But he paid half, and he told the parts manager he'd have the rest before planting season. The parts manager, a man named Dwight who'd known Roy for 20 years, said that was fine. Roy got home as the sun was going down and stood in the machine shed, looking at the space where the 8450 had been parked for 6 years. There was still a rectangle of cleaner concrete where the weight of the machine had kept the dust off, the outlines of where the row units had rested. He stood there for a while. The thing about losing a piece of iron you've trusted is that it's not just a financial subtraction. A 12-row planter that you've calibrated and maintained and run through 6 seasons of varied soil and uncertain weather becomes something more than a machine. It knows the ground. Or rather, you know it. You know the feel of it behind the tractor at the right speed in the right conditions. You know which row tends to run shallow if you don't watch the pressure on that end. You know the sound of the seed monitor when the population drifts 0.5% and what adjustment brings it back. That knowledge doesn't transfer. It stays in you, but it has nowhere to go. Roy had known farmers who'd lost equipment to fire, to flood, to repo men at 2 in the morning. He'd always thought the worst version would be the repo man. At least with fire, there was an insurance claim and some clarity. With a bank taking equipment, there was the particular humiliation of watching men you knew load your machinery and drive it away. But the auction had been its own kind of thing. He hadn't thought about the pivot arm. He'd looked at the closing wheel and told himself it could wait. He'd greased the zerks and blown out the seed tubes and painted the chipped wing panel, and he'd missed the one thing that mattered when 60 people were standing in a field watching. That was the part that stayed with him through November and into December as the ground froze and the year wound down toward whatever the next one would bring. By January, Roy had worked out a planting arrangement with a neighbor, a younger farmer named Cody Brandt, who ran a 16-row Kinsey planter on 1,200 acres and had the capacity to custom plant Roy's ground for a per-acre rate. It wasn't the same. Roy would be standing at the field edge, watching someone else's equipment turn his soil, someone else's meter monitors, checking seed populations that he used to set himself. That was a different kind of loss, not financial, not even entirely practical. It was the loss of authorship, the loss of being the man who put the crop in the ground. He negotiated with Cody on a rate that Roy thought was fair, and Cody thought was fair, and they shook hands on it in January. Cody was a good farmer. His kins ran clean. Roy had watched him plant before and had no complaints about the work, but it wasn't the same. In February, Roy drove to an implement dealer in Garden City that had a used planter inventory, not to buy, just to look. He walked a row of used units parked outside, a couple of John Deere 7000s, a white 8100, an older Case IH planter with worn row units, and at the end of the row, a Massey Ferguson 8400 with 8 rows and individual row clutches that had come off a retiring farmer's estate. It was older than his 8450 had been. It needed meter work. One of the down-pressure springs was broken. Roy walked it for 20 minutes. He checked the pivot arms on both wings. He checked the seed tube condition on all 8 rows. He crouched down and looked at the disc opener blade thickness on the front row units and the rear row units. He didn't buy it. He couldn't afford to. But he knew that machine. He knew how it worked, what it needed, what it would do in a good seed bed, and what it would struggle with in rough ground. 31 years of running Massey Ferguson iron had given him a knowledge that was specific and deep and couldn't be found in a spec sheet. He drove home in the February cold and turned into the county road that ran alongside his ground, the 640 acres that were his father's before him and his grandfather's lease before that. The wheat stubble was still there under a thin crust of snow waiting for spring. His ground, still his ground. The bank note was paid. The parts bill was half settled. The planting arrangement with Cody Brandt was in place. The machine shed had empty concrete where the 8450 used to sit. Roy Callahan had lost his planter at the worst possible moment, in front of the worst possible crowd, for the worst possible price. He had scraped together the bank payment from private sales and shop tools and 40 years of accumulated farmer's instinct about what to keep and what to let go. He had not lost the land. He had not lost the operating line. He had not lost the respect of the men he dealt with, Graber at the bank, Dwight at the parts counter, Stuber up in Buckland who'd called at 5 in the morning because he'd seen something and thought it was worth a phone call. What he'd lost was the planter. And the knowledge of what a closing wheel assembly that needed looking at could cost you when you let it go one more season. That was the part that stayed with him hardest. Not the money, not the auction crowd's silence, not the hammer falling at 15-7 when the floor was 22. It was the image of that pivot arm letting go, the wing section dropping, the closing wheel swinging loose in front of 140 people who instantly understood exactly what they were looking at. He'd known. Not consciously, not in a way he could have named in October when he was preparing the machine for sale. But somewhere underneath the deliberate maintenance and the careful preparation, he had known that wing section wasn't right. He had felt it in the way the machine folded last spring, a slight hesitation that he'd attributed to cold hydraulic fluid and then forgotten. A farmer who spent 3 decades behind equipment knows things before he knows them. Roy had known. And he'd painted the chipped panel and blown out the seed tubes and replaced the closing wheel bolts on the other wing and missed the one thing that was actually wrong. You could call that bad luck. Some men would. Roy Callahan didn't call it that. He called it what it was, in the private language of a man who holds himself to the standard his father set. He'd gotten lazy on the inspection. He'd let the surface maintenance crowd out the deep check. He'd been so focused on making the machine look right that he'd let himself believe it was right. In March, when the ground started to soften and Cody Brandt called to talk through the planting schedule, Roy pulled out the yellow legal pad from November and started a new column. Equipment he could reacquire. Equipment he could rebuild from used parts. What a 12-row planter cost in the current used market versus what 8 rows would get him back to production. The numbers were not impossible. They were not easy, but they were not impossible. Roy Callahan had been farming 31 years. The land was still his. The winter wheat would come up in April. Cody Brandt's kins would put the corn in at the right population and the right depth, and Roy would walk the rows afterward and check the emergence and count the stands. It wasn't how he'd built his operation. It wasn't how he'd farmed for 30 years, but it was how he was going to farm this year. And that was going to have to be enough. Because in western Kansas, enough, when you still have the land and you still have the operating line and the note is paid and the parts bill is half settled, enough is not nothing. Enough is how you get to the next season. And Roy Callahan had been farming long enough to know that the next season is the only one that matters.